Hi, I'm Jason Leavy and I'm the founder of Prime Performance Labs. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, the cognitive neuroscientist Samira Cutts.
Hi, I'm Samira. I'm based in Dubai and I work at King's College Hospital, London, and I'm studying a PhD in cognitive neuroscience.
So, Samira, neuroscience, very popular term, but I think there are a lot of misconceptions. So, in very simple terms, how would you explain it?
So, very basically, neuroscience is simply the study of the nervous system and the brain. And there are different branches of neuroscience, but in essence, it's simply a way for us to understand how the brain operates and relates on a practical level.
So, when we're talking about cognitive health and cognitive performance, clearly neuroscience is critical to that understanding.
Well, I think so. I'm a little bit biased, but very much so. I think it's relevant to absolutely everybody in terms of trying to improve and enhance and grow as an individual in whatever science and field that you may be operating in.
So, if we look at this through the lens of leadership, what is it that neuroscience can actually teach us?
That's a great question, actually. And I think it's so relevant for everybody and often gets neglected or perhaps downgraded, shall we say. Essentially, our brain is our command center. Every decision, every function comes from the brain or is very much directly linked to every organ, every function in our body. So if we think about how we operate as humans, nothing goes past the brain. That is the command center. As a leader, a huge element of that role requires the absolute optimal cognitive performance. So you have to have great memory, great processing speed, wonderful problem solving abilities. So the executive function part of our brain, the thinking part of our brain, has to be as sharp as possible. And by having an understanding and a concept of neuroscience and how our brain operates and how we can get the most out of it will help us to be more effective leaders in order to learn how to fast track particular cognitive faculties and operate on a higher level.
So, in terms of leadership, what can neuroscience actually teach us?
So much. There's so many wonderful things that we can gain from having the knowledge and understanding that neuroscience provides us. So, as I mentioned, neuroscience is the study of the brain and the nervous system, which is essentially the command center. Now, of course, the way we operate as humans, the mind and the body is very much connected. It's an integrated system. They work as a whole. And so, as leaders, a huge element of their role is to have the most enhanced cognitive performance possible. So let me break that down a little bit. They need to have great memory, high processing speed, wonderful problem solving capabilities. They need to be able to think very quickly. So reaction time is important and be able to make the best decisions under high elements of pressure. So in order to do that, your brain has to really perform at the highest possible level. In order to do that, of course, like going to the gym for your body and developing muscles and increasing muscle mass, the brain is very much the same. It's not static and rigid. It's something that you have to shape and mold and learn and develop and grow further over time. And so having a foundational knowledge and understanding of how to do this will help one to be a much more effective leader.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, the big revelation after 20 plus years in leadership roles, having trained as an executive coach, was the understanding that not only can we measure our brain health, we can literally improve it. So when it comes to cognitive performance, as you said, all those critical areas, the ability to manage stress, the ability to regulate emotions, the ability to make complex decisions under pressure, this can all be measured and improved. Correct?
Very much so, in a very quantitative manner. So this really comes down to our understanding of a concept called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is essentially the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself. So what that means is it falls very much in line with a more well-known concept called growth mindset. Very much the same sort of elements. What we're looking at is measuring specific brain functions. So again, it could be either on a network level, so looking at the connectivity, or we could be looking at the brainwave state function, or we could also be measuring neurotransmitter function. So you can take and gather all of these different pieces of information, put them together in order to identify how well the brain is able to learn and develop in very specific cognitive functions.
So what I generally find fascinating about neuroscience is here's a leadership superpower hiding in plain sight. 20 plus years in management roles, 20 plus years in leadership roles. I trained as an exec coach at INSEAD, as you know. And yet, for me, there appears to be this invisible curtain between leadership, training and development over here, neuroscience over there, despite cognitive health and performance being absolutely critical to succeeding as a leader. Why do you think that is?
That's such a difficult question, a wonderful question as well. I think it's a difficult one for me to answer because I'm so embedded within the scientific field and also in terms of physical medicine. So for me, it really does make no sense as to why there is that separation or segregation. Because for me, the mind, the body is so integrated that just seems like a natural element of playing a significant role when it comes to developing and shaping human behavior. So I'm actually going to throw that question back to you because you are the expert when it comes to coaching. So why do you think that actually is?
Well, you mentioned about things being separated, and we've spoken before about this creation of artificial silos. And I think that's certainly the case when it comes to leadership development. I think it's very fragmented. I also think, if I'm being honest, but so much of it is stuck in the 1990s. So it hasn't embraced what science, data and tech can now teach us about the human mind and body. The final thing I think is that unlike elite teams in sports or in the military, there's been a resistance in the boardroom to embracing science. And I think that's partly because there's been a tendency to mythologize the idea of the individual being uniquely gifted or having a unique level of willpower. So I think that creates a situation where people aren't receptive to the developments we've made in science and technology.
I also think that from a business stance, it's almost like, certainly historically or traditionally, there was this notion, go hard or go home. I still think that's at play very much so even now, where senior leadership members do believe that you have to give everything, and otherwise it's a lack of commitment. And almost like if you are sacrificing your health, that's also almost seen as a sense of commitment.
It's like a badge of honor in certain cases.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to pull people away from that. And again, the science speaks for itself. People can have differing opinions, but if we are going to be evidence-based and as logical about this as possible, and essentially we are trying to maximize function here. If you look at how much we can grow and develop our cognitive and brain function by taking care of our physical and mental health, we can actually very clearly, measurably identify how much more of a better leader one can be by actually putting the focus of physical and mental health at the forefront of leadership. So that very much is contradictory and goes against this archaic notion that you should be sacrificing your health in order to show that you are a better leader.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because we see it all the time in the media. Despite what we know about things like burnout, despite what neuroscience can teach us about the reality of how extended hours take a toll on your cognitive performance and ultimately, to your point, on your health, there's still this tendency to celebrate those who work crazy hours, despite all the evidence saying it's impossible to be effective in role doing that. Yeah. And I think that's pretty toxic.
I completely agree. And obviously, you know that I work in a clinical role as well. So on a daily basis, I do see a lot of corporate executives come into the clinic and they are very much burnt out and end up going down more of an autoimmune trajectory and really having a long-term serious adverse impact on their health. And there seems to be, again, a very wide disparity between what we see clinically and within healthcare and what we are advising individuals and actually what goes on in the boardroom. It feels like we're not speaking the same language. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And given that we are talking about coaching, Jason, actually, I think this is such a relevant point. We know that human beings are so incredibly complex and multi-layered. And what the wonderful thing about coaching is that you are able to explore some of those nuances and identify what are those cognitive biases at play, what behaviors are habitual that are unhelpful to an individual that are actually creating limitations in one's leadership success. And I think that's the beauty of really what we do here, is in a very safe and open manner, opening that up to the floor for discussion and trying to find better solutions so that essentially you can continue to climb that ladder, but not at the sacrifice of your health.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things we both feel strongly about is grounding this in reality. You know, telling a leader who's time poor and has family commitments as well as professional commitments that they should be doing 2 hours of meditation a night, for example. It's never going to happen, right? It's fantasy. And I think importantly, what we know again from science, as well as real world applications such as world of elite sports, is the key is knowing when you have to be a 10 out of 10 in that all on action mode. But then crucially, when you have those finite windows to rest and recover, but you maximize them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of reminds me of some of the workshops that we've done when we cover some of the nervous system aspects. So you've heard me talk a lot about how the nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And so one part, the sympathetic, is very much that go, go, go element, helping you to get things done and to achieve things. And then the alternate side of that is the parasympathetic, where we need to relax and replenish our stores. And so again, embedding that scientific knowledge about how we operate on a very, basic human level into the way that we work in the workplace is really the core element of being successful.
Yeah, and I think, look, this is, for me, the magic of neuroscience is, even 5 years ago, I would be talking to somebody about the importance of, composure and finding the right activities to try and de-stress, etc. However, with neuroscience, we've got the evidence of A, the level of stress, B, the type of activities that will take you into that parasympathetic state as quickly as possible so you can rest and replenish. And crucially, let's talk about something we both feel strongly about, those activities that don't. Hello, social media.
Yes, absolutely. It can be a double-edged sword, can't it? And I think as humans, we all need to be aware of things that are working for us and things that are working against us, and trying to have that balance, of course, but also trying to move further towards the things that are more in alignment with our goals and are in alignment with our health, because essentially it's one and the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, for me, it's performance plus well-being. You cannot perform at your best if you're not a healthy human. It really is that simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or certainly in a sustainable manner. I think that's a key. We can all maintain very high levels of performance for a very finite period. But again, there's a very clear reason why top sportsmen will have periods of deep recovery and relaxation, because otherwise you won't hit that 10 out of 10 when you need to. You'll be at what Josh Waitzkin refers to as that dreadful simmering 6, where you're just ticking along in that horrible zone somewhere between greatness and burnout. And nobody wants to be there.
Or actually, perhaps even worse, mediocrity. That's what we're all scared of, is just being mediocre. I think that's where a lot of people actually lay, is that they're not quite burnt out, but they're definitely not at their most optimal. And so it's easy to just get into a bit of a lull. And because it's very familiar, it's comfortable, what's going to help that person to come out of that comfort zone, but actually move up rather than down? And that's where I think coaching is so helpful. And also that underlying foundational understanding of neuroscience is to help people to recognize that and to constantly question, and with curiosity, what can they be doing? Is this helpful? Is this unhelpful? Is this moving me further towards what I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So let's talk about stress. I think we've touched on burnout already, but that's a spectrum, isn't it? You know, there are different kinds of stress. Not all stress is bad. In fact, when we want high performance, we need to be in a certain stress mode
Yeah.
to be able to be hyper focused and intense, perform at our best. But of course, with acute stress, things become far worse, and we see that manifest itself not just mentally, but physically as well. Talk to me a bit more about stress.
So, very much as you mentioned, stress is not actually a bad thing. It can be a very good thing. It's there to help to motivate us and encourage us to reach our goals. So, it's designed to instigate what we call that fight, flight, freeze response. And when we undergo any kind of physical or psychological threat, the stress hormones will then be released into our body, and that will create one of those responses. But regardless of which response it is, it's to create action in some form or another, and also to keep us safe. The issue arises when the stress continues. So we are only designed to experience stress over short periods of time, because then after that, we need to rest in order to replenish and recover those stress hormones that have been used so that we can replenish those stores. And our muscles can recuperate, our eyesight, our physical body can recover, because it is very much, again, both a psychological, emotional, physical experience, a multisensory experience. But often what we see in modern day is that we have many multiple continuous psychological threats. So the brain can never, it's constantly trying to put out fires, so to speak. And so it never really gets that period of recovery. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because we then switch from acute stress into chronic stress mode. And when we go into chronic stress, that's where a lot of damage is done. So again, if we're in a period of chronic stress for a long enough time, that will then start to have an impact on our immune system. So it will knock on the door of our immune system and tell them something is very wrong and they need to get involved in order to protect us. So again, short-term inflammation is a good thing, but long-term it's not. So once the immune system is involved, it will activate all of our inflammatory markers. So like I said, short-term, that's a good thing, but long-term, it's a bad thing, because then it believes that there is a serious threat, an illness and a disease. But if all of this is actually coming from psychological threats, there is no physical disease, but then one will be created. And that's what we call autoimmune diseases. So then you're going to go down that autoimmune trajectory, and you are absolutely going to be subpar in terms of your health. And so when we go back to leadership performance, that is very much related to cognitive health. And we know that cognitive and physical health are bidirectional. And so if we are going down an autoimmune trajectory, we cannot perform at our optimal cognitive level. So that will take away from our leadership success. Not to mention that we're humans, and emotionally, that's very draining and very distressing, and can have a huge impact on one's personal life, relationships, and overall quality of life, really.
So the obvious question, I'm a leader, I'm in constant firefighting mode. I want to ensure that I can be on my A game when it matters, but equally I want to find ways of resting and recovering in those narrow windows that I get. What does that look like in terms of practical techniques I can implement into my everyday life in the context of being so time poor?
Again, I like to go back to the foundational elements that we all need to focus on as humans, and they go back to sleep. So sleep is very much a low-hanging fruit, and it is such a superpower in terms of optimizing our cognitive function. So for example, even just having 2 hours of sleep less per night can reduce your brain function by 30%. It's a huge amount.
Yeah.
So if you're always operating at a really high level, you can see immediately how that will impact on you on a day-to-day basis at work. So making sure that you get 8 to 9 hours of sleep is really, really important. And it needs to be a deep sleep where you are going into that REM sleep phase, so that your brain is able to clear those toxins and actually consolidate learning from that day before, so that you are actually, again, going through those neuroplastic changes and being able to learn from what you are going through on a day-to-day basis. The other important one is movement. movement is a wonderful way to de-stress and really try and take away a lot of the pressures that you feel physically in your body. And it's a way of just zoning out and switching off from the day and being able to focus on yourself. It's a wonderful, wonderful way of really trying to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. But again, you need to be careful about what type of movement you're doing. Because often what I see with the corporate execs is they'll go from the boardroom straight into a HIIT style training. And again, that will massively increase cortisol levels and instigate that stress response, which is very counterintuitive and the opposite of what we're trying to achieve by moving. So also need to think carefully about the type of movement that we are engaging in.
And I think timing as well. I think that's something that's very neglected, right? Is that time of training. It's interesting. Dr. Brendan and I were talking about one client and hadn't seen the correlation between the challenges he was having sleeping and the fact he was working out in an intense manner fairly late in the evening. So again, I think that's where this holistic approach becomes critical to understand the relationship between all those different modalities.
Yeah. Another thing that we often see when we conduct a particular investigation known as EEG, which is electroencephalogram, which is where we place electrodes on the scalp in order to measure different brainwave functions. So you can see very clearly from looking at somebody's brainwave state how much time they spend feeling stressed and how much time they feel relaxed. What I often find working with corporate executives is often their brain is always just so highly switched on and they start to forget how to turn the dial down in order to relax. And there's no way of cheating an EEG. It's a very visual snapshot of what's going on internally within the brain. And learning, when you're not at work, remember, you actually have to still switch off. But how many people do that? Even when you're not working, you're thinking about replying to an email or making sure you're going to meet a deadline or doing all the things that you need to do that you don't get to think about during work. But essentially, from a physical cognitive health perspective, you're still working, which means you're not relaxing, which means you are deteriorating your health and also your ability to be more successful at work the next day.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's an element there as well of what I'd refer to as the glamorization of busy. I think there can be a tendency, and I was certainly guilty of this in a number of my corporate roles, of embracing that always on mindset to the extent of even badging myself on it, not realizing the damage it was potentially doing. And I think in two ways, physiologically, but also quite frankly, identity. If you are so over-identified in terms of your role rather than you as a human and an individual, then I think that's a dangerous path as well.
Very much so. I think we talked about this earlier informally, didn't we? About the importance of not attaching your identity to your occupation. Because when you inevitably experience failure, and we all know that failure is a part of the human experience, and you will at some point multiple times experience failure, and actually that's not a bad thing, but more on that later. When you do inevitably experience failure, if you attach your identity so closely to a specific role or occupation, that will naturally impact on your self-worth. Whereas if you are able to detach your identity to all of these different roles that you play in your life, that's a much healthier, helpful way of viewing oneself and making sure that you maintain optimal mental health.
So let's talk about failure, because I think it's a critical area. I've got very strong views on it. You spoke earlier about growth mindset. Failure is critical for growth, and I think needs reframing in the context of leadership, because those are really key learning points. And I think, again, the science supports this.
Yeah, very much so. It's actually really interesting how in other aspects, like sports, for example, failure is sort of accepted. It's never pleasant. It's very much a bitter pill to swallow. But we know that as individuals, as humans, we grow so much from those lessons. Because essentially, when we look at the way that the brain works and from a cognitive perspective, when you make mistakes, you learn from them. You update your schema, your motor program, your pattern And that is essential. It's almost like an upgrade. Without making those mistakes, you never really get an opportunity to create an upgrade. So they should be celebrated, but also recognizing it's never pleasant. We always want to be successful, but it's part and parcel of growing. But it almost feels like within the leadership field, there is no room for failure, and it is very frowned upon. And again, that's in misalignment with how we operate as humans, because as a human, we know if we fail, we grow and we get better. So there needs to be a shift in our way of thinking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for me, it's about adopting an experimental mindset. And what I mean by that, and I'm referring to your world of science, which is simply scientists will go into an experiment fully expecting to fail and wanting to fail, because that will throw up a series of data points,
Very much
but
so.
ensure that the next experiment will be closer. None of them expect to be able to crack the code in the very first experiment. And we know this from history. If we look at Edison in the past, if we look at Dyson more recently, and the thousands of attempts and iterations to get to where they wanted to be. So I think to be a successful leader, I think it's absolutely critical. You have that experimental mindset.
Yeah. But you know what really stands out for me between those analogies that you use, which were lovely, is that with scientists, it's objective. Everything is objective. It's not personalized.
Yeah.
You know, so if there is an error, even if it's a human error, we label it as, oh, this was a human error. But there's no emotional context behind that human error. It's accepted on an objective level, and we learn from it and we move on. But in every other context, especially the leadership field, it's hyper personalized. It's taken very personally. It can also be used, depending on the culture that you work in, against you, almost as a form of blaming. And then that makes things, again, very multifaceted.
Yeah.
There's a deep layer going on there because, again, as humans, there's a lot of emotional experiences around this. It's not just behavior, it's emotional. And there's a lot of power plays. So I think all of these things do need to be taken into consideration. But if there is a way from learning from science, it is that to be a little bit more objective. So taking more of a systems-based approach and identifying, okay, this didn't work well. It's not because of the person, it's because the process was at fault. And then that creates a much better solution to try and optimize that issue rather than taking it personally.
Yeah. And I love the reference to a systems-based approach, because I feel very strongly that at the moment, the siloed approach is not just outdated. Neuroscience teaches us it's wrong, right? There is no mental health and physical health.
Yeah.
There is no performance over here and well-being here. Everything is interconnected in terms of the mind and the body.
Yeah. And I think that's a much more helpful and healthier way to viewing things. If we see that everything is integrated, then everything is factored in. And I think people are more likely to take care of certain elements like the physical side of things or the emotional side of things, because all of these elements essentially will significantly impact on one's decision-making abilities, which in essence is one of the most important factors involved in being a successful leader, is making the right decisions.
Yeah. If we accept that cognitive health and performance is this secret superpower of leadership, what are the things that affect that? Great quality sleep,
Yeah.
good exercise. I think nutrition is one, again, that's
very
misunderstood in terms of its ability to affect your cognitive health.
Yeah, so there's a huge area of inflammation and brain inflammation. And there's a lot of wonderful doctors out there. One of my favorites is Dr. Mark Hyman, who essentially known
fantastic.
as food is medicine. So food can be very medicinal. Essentially, food can either help you with your health goals or really take that away. So there's a lot of work at the moment and research around brain inflammation, because essentially a lot of the chronic diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's is a form, and COVID, a form of brain inflammation. So nutrition is hugely important. But another one, again, is stress. Again, we see this time and time again. And I go back to when I earlier said about trying to target the low-hanging fruit. Stress is essentially a low-hanging fruit, because we all know what role it plays, but we underplay how much it derails us and how much it damages our health. And if I had to pick one thing, I would say that stress is the number one killer of health.
Yeah, and certainly I think if you surveyed a poll of top leaders, they'd say stress and, of course, ultimately burnout is their primary concern. And this is the knife edge of high performance that we've spoken about in terms of how do you show up at your best and perform at your optimum level, but then how do you know how to dial down as quickly and efficiently as possible?
That's the gold.
And I think, the foundational elements that we keep on coming back to time and time again are great quality sleep, eating well, moving well. It's not rocket science, right?
It's really not. And even on a cognitive level, there are so many wonderful strategies that can be employed, such as meditation, even, mindful movement. So not necessarily going hard and exercising at the gym, but smaller, lower level things like walking actually is a wonderful strategy. It's probably my favorite because it's free. You can do it anywhere. And it actually enhances cognitive function. So the more that you walk and you move and you are thinking whilst you're walking, the better the decision-making abilities. So why would we not use that to our advantage?
Some of the best coaching,
That's okay.
Some of the best coaching conversations I've been involved in as a coach, but also as a coachee, because I practice what I preach, have been during walks, particularly in nature. There's a phrase I absolutely love, which is walking is moving meditation.
Very much so. One thing I wanted to add to the stress conversation is, and I was just thinking whilst we were talking about this, is actually the key essence to managing stress, because it's unrealistic to think that we shouldn't have any stress in our lives whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I do actually agree to trying to eliminate as much stress as possible. But at the same time, I do recognize that you can't completely eliminate all stress. There are always going to be stressful events, particular stressful triggers. And so the key to that is knowing when to dial up, but then also when to dial down. And it's that adaptive transitional phase, I think, for us as humans that is really challenging. And if we could figure that out, we're onto something.
And I think the great thing is we can figure it out, right? Because I agree with you. If I look at some of my most meaningful moments, not just in work, but in life, there's been a healthy dose of stress, that could be doing a big deal at work, or it could be a pitch. I remember the walk to the boxing ring was particularly stressful. But these are also the moments that, because of that intensity, are so memorable. You feel so completely alive. So I think absolutely and I think we're very clear that stress is not a bad thing per se. It's the different types of stress and how prolonged that exposure is.
Yeah. I think we've all had our personal challenges with stress, and me certainly, just because I have a neurodivergent brain. So we tend to be more susceptible to stress than neurotypical individuals. And some of my go-to strategies that I've learned that are just bulletproof are running on the beach and just being immersed in nature. So I love walking and hiking in nature and being by the ocean. And so there is a theme amongst all of these things, and that's movement and nature. And they are immediately relaxing and will help to decompress your brain. So the more we can learn to engage ourselves in regular, weekly, daily activities involved with movement and nature, then we've got the core elements that we need to be able to manage that stress well.
And crucially, again, this isn't just an opinion. Science proves this is the case,
so.
right? I mean, I've seen the photographs of what happens in the brain during a walk in nature versus doom scrolling, for example. And it's night and day in terms of the positive impact on the brain.
Yeah.
So let's again talk about it in the context of time poor leaders. So practical things are short walk in nature. It's something like breath work, meditation, reading a physical book.
Very much so. Yeah. So all of those things, what we've identified from all of those activities, the core theme that they all share is completely switching off and doing something completely different, where you are so focused on that task that it takes you away from your troubles, your worries, pressure. And that's what creates that feeling of relaxation.
Now, here's the thing. So many people will say, I find it difficult to switch off. They experience discomfort. And again, we would say, embrace that discomfort. That, again, is what a growth mindset entails, that ability to sit with discomfort. I love this phrase. I heard it first from the psychologist Kimberly Wilson, sort of distress tolerance.
Yes.
And I think this is critical, right? You don't just give up on this. You immerse yourself in it. You tolerate it. You embrace the positive change it's eventually going to have on your mindset.
It's okay to be uncomfortable. I think it's so, again, this is another very common nuance of being human. We are creatures of comfort and we love routine. But the downside of those things is that it reduces your tolerance to distress and discomfort, which we know is very much part of the human experience. So I think actually actively seeking out activities that create certain element of discomfort and trying to every so often put yourself at the very edge of that discomfort in order to then create a higher threshold and tolerance level can only be a good thing. And you can play this out very nicely in terms of physical activity again, so strength training.
Yeah. And that's what I love about this is I've strongly believed for a long time that we should embrace adversity and growth comes from that. What I wasn't aware of until I started studying neuroscience was the science supports this belief. Quite literally, by seeking out adversity and embracing that discomfort, you are positively rewiring your brain.
Very much so. And there's many different areas that we could go into here. And one thing I do want to talk about is, and we're just going to touch on it briefly, is adverse human experiences and trauma, which at some point, as you get older, there will be an element of that, whether it's in childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, or older adulthood. We will all experience something related to that. And we often think, again, it is distressing and it is uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, but you can use that and use it to drive you and fuel you and to learn from it and actually become a better human and to grow from it. So that horrible, distressing, adverse experience can be helping you to rewire and go down the route where you would like to see yourself, your future self, to really reach and achieve those goals.
So I'm going to quote something to you. It's from a very unlikely source, but it's something I feel very strongly about. So Bruce Lee once said, absorb what is useful, discard what is useless.
Yes.
For me, I feel strongly that's our philosophy. Simply because I feel that one size fits all approach is not just outdated, it's wrong, you know, and I'm sure many people listening or watching this will feel the same way. They know when they've tried to do something and it feels like a jacket that doesn't fit. What's the science behind this?
Again, it's a form of decluttering, isn't it? And from a cognitive stance, it's about updating your schema, your mode program. So understanding what works for you. And this will be constantly changing and evolving over time and through different life experiences and different life stages. So what worked for you before may perhaps serve to limit you in the present. So it's about creating an awareness and identification of what those behaviors are and essentially removing those and rewiring your brain. And the way that you rewire it is actually by engaging in the activities or behaviors that do serve you. So the more you repeat them over and over again, the more you will sort of bank that into the long-term memory. And then that memory will become so highly consolidated over time if you are consistently repeating it, that it will override the old behavior that doesn't serve you anymore. So again, what you can see here really nicely is the comparison between negativity and positivity. If you keep going over your problems, they become bigger and heavier because you keep reminding your brain how problematic they are. one way to overcome those problems is not to focus on the problems, but to focus on what you would like, or the solution, or how you would like things to be, or the way that you do envisage it in the future. So again, a form of visualization. So focusing more on how you would like it to be, the path you would like to be on, where you do see yourself in the future. And by doing so, you actually reach there much faster, because then that's at the forefront of your mind. And then what will feel intuitive, what will actually happen is you will then move in that direction naturally. Again, the law of attraction. And then over time, slowly, you will overwrite those problems, you will overcome them, you will forget them, and you will move in the direction that you want to go to. So that's a really powerful form of awareness, and being able to really harness that and create clarity, and being able to do that at a much higher, faster level will then just only really consolidate that success that you experience. So, Jason, one of the lovely things about working with you, I find, is that you don't take a cookie cutter approach. You are very customized and specific to each individual that you work with. And as you mentioned earlier, you often find that traditional leadership style training can be archaic, because it does try to take one way of working and fit that into every single individual. So I love that. But at the same time, in terms of your work and how you work specifically with individuals to try and maximize their leadership success, is there a specific framework that you follow? How do you work with individuals?
I think a framework is helpful. I think a framework can give freedom because it sets the parameters. So you have a clear sense of focus and purpose behind your work. Foundational level is sleep. It's a non-negotiable. Science tells us this, as you know. If you are not getting good quality sleep, you are not going to be able to perform in a sustainable manner. If we then look at energy, again, critical, and we know that exercise and nutrition are huge contributors to energy. And then in this context of well-being, I think it's about balance. It's about trying to achieve that equilibrium as much as possible. And then for me, the final piece of the puzzle is purpose. Everybody has to have a North Star. For me at the moment, you'll see, for example, a lot of focus on longevity. And I think ultimately it's a healthy thing and it's a good aspiration. But a missing piece of the jigsaw frequently is for what? For what? I'm slightly uncomfortable with longevity being an end goal for the sake of longevity. I think human beings, and again, data and science tend to support this, lead a more meaningful life when they have a sense of purpose. So I think that's really critical. It's not just about quantity of life, it's about quality of life. And I think, as you know, with Prime Performance Labs, we're adopting North Star methodology because I think you can have all these other areas in balance, but if you're lacking your why, what do you really have? Balance against that, I think it's almost impossible to have a clear, accurate idea of what your why is if you're not in the right place when it comes to well-being. So if you're not looking after your sleep, if your energy levels are low, if you are feeling unbalanced or stuck or lost, there's no way you're going to be in a position to work out your why.
Yeah.
Everything, as we know, is interconnected. That's what I keep on coming back to. And I think what neuroscience gives us is amazing data and insights, but then allow us as coaches to build on that and take action from those insights and explore the best path forward for that individual. So let's talk neuromyths. Let's talk what science really says. So we spoke earlier about how many individuals pride themselves on the amount of hours that they do for a long period of time. So working harder and longer is what's required for great leadership. What does neuroscience say?
No, disagree. I need a buzzer. As we talked about this earlier, recovery is essential and a key part of being more successful and achieving more. So but bursts of work and productivity with periods of recovery and recuperation are far more successful and will be a fast track way of getting you to be where you want to be than go just continuously working and burning yourself out.
So in simple terms, the data tells us
No.
that the longer, the more hours you do over a certain point.
It's counterintuitive,
Yeah.
counterproductive, absolutely.
I am who I am. I can't help it. What does neuroscience say?
Well, going back to our earlier discussion about mindset, that's very much in alignment with a fixed mindset. And what we know about our brain is that we are constantly evolving and growing and learning and developing. And we even know now that as adults, historically, we thought that we did not have the capacity to grow new brain cells, but we now know that we can. Form known as adult hippocampal neurogenesis. So that just evidences our ability to be able to constantly learn and grow. So I think that is just a person who says that doesn't want to change. But actually, we very much have the capacity to change and to develop and to let go of behaviors that no longer serve us and to learn and develop new behaviors that are more helpful and serve us better.
So we know that growth comes from discomfort. Equally, we know that many people prefer the pain of the familiar over the fear of the unknown. So a bit of a provocative statement, because so many people, so many leaders will say they want to change. And the reality is they're in a fixed mindset and they actually prefer the pain of the known versus the unknown and the inevitable discomfort that accompanies that. What would you say to those who struggle to embrace change?
I think, again, if we look at it from a behavioral perspective, that can be helpful to people. So really sitting down and almost having like a side-by-side list. So on one side, writing down all the behaviors that you are repeating that you're not happy with. And alongside that, write down what you think you could do differently. And acknowledge the discomfort and the difficulty with change, but also really focus on how much growth and how helpful it will be to let go of that old behavior and how much that's limiting you, and focusing on this new behavior and how much that would help you to grow, and really seeing yourself in it. So again, going back to visualization, really place yourself in the future. Visualize what you look like doing this activity or engaging in this behavior. Don't just focus on the behavior itself, focus on the environment, make it as real as possible. Because again, what we know from neuroscience is whatever we visualize is our brain's reality, whether it's actually embedded in reality or not. So that's why visualization is such a powerful tool. So if you can regularly visualize yourself engaging in a behavior that you would like to see more of in the future, the more you visualize it, the more likelihood it will become a reality.
So I want to jump in here and make one crucial distinction, because I know we're on the same page here. Visualization is scientifically valid, but it requires agency and action, because I think there can be a tendency for people to say that just thinking is somehow enough for something to happen. It has to be followed up by implementation and execution, correct?
Absolutely. So it's not just thinking about it, but it's actually truly having a belief that that is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. And then going one step further and actually identifying, okay, how do we make this a reality? What needs to happen? So setting goals and objectives, and then even within the goals and objectives, having long-term goals and medium term and short term. And again, with those objectives, so you are actually creating like a map or an action plan to where you are trying to get to.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it ties in with something I feel really strongly about, which is change can be intimidating, change can be overwhelming. The importance of proximate objectives. So again, to use a very crude metaphor, rather than looking at the top of Everest, you are looking at those first 100, 200 meters and what it takes to cover that ground. And then you look up and you go again. I think that's important in terms of breaking any process of change into manageable steps. So I will always talk about how great leadership is this wonderful blend of art and science. Now, the phrase gut instinct is used a lot when it comes to things like intuitive decision making. What's the science behind gut instinct?
Oh, that's really interesting, actually, because, and even just that term, gut instinct. So often people will say the gut doesn't lie. And what we now know from a neuroscience perspective is the gut is almost like a second brain. And there is a direct link between the brain up here and the second brain, essentially the gut. And it's connected through the vagus nerve. So whatever we think, we feel in our guts. It's like the thinking, feeling. That connection is extremely important, and it's bi-directional. Some people will even go as far as saying, actually, the gut is the first brain and this is the second brain. So that's where that actual term, I don't know if that's how it was coined, but that's definitely the science behind the gut instinct. And so following on from that is really, really important. That's sort of one of the special elements of being human are all about, is sometimes you can't articulate or provide a logical reasoning for something, but you just know it's right.
I think we see this so much, right? I mean, I've worked with so many people who refer to things like brain fog, for example. What they're actually referring to is their cognitive stores and they're being depleted, and their inability to perform at their best cognitively. Food comas, again, is a perfect example where there's a showing an instinctive understanding of the impact nutrition can have physically and mentally. It's just now neuroscience is really putting shape to this, and I think those in leadership roles are understanding these interconnected relationships.
And one thing I want to add is, something that we already know widely, certainly within the field of medicine and neuroscience and all elements of science, is that as humans, we are multisensory beings. So we learn not just from how we speak and how we think, but actually we learn from our environment. So we learn through touch, visually, sound, taste. These are all really, really key ways that we gain data. And so naturally, when we are thinking, sometimes before we even think it, we feel it. And again, going back to that analogy, that concept, that statement of gut instinct. And the gut is where we feel. And again, one of my favorite books by a wonderful psychologist is The Body Keeps the Score. And so certainly in times of ill health, we won't know it, but we will feel it. So learning to allow those elements to guide you is very important. And it goes back to your methodology of the North Star. That is one way of maintaining on that path and following your North Star, is not just through thinking, but through feeling.
So I love this because one of the most profound elements of my INSEAD exec coaching experience was the importance of treating emotions as data points. And I'd strongly urge anyone to do that, in terms of the amount our own mind and body is telling us that too often we don't tune into because we're on autopilot, rather than stopping, asking yourself, what is going on here? What's happening? Reflecting on that, because I think that throws up really valuable information. One fascinating thing that I read recently was that elite athletes, the biggest indicator of their ability to perform was how they felt.
Precisely.
So incredible data around them in everything they do, yet self-perception was the only truly reliable indicator of how they would show up.
It's fascinating, actually. And I think you've been very kind when you said that the reason why there is a disparity between thinking and feeling is because we go on autopilot. But I actually think it goes much further than that. I think almost modern society has created a complete disconnect. And it's almost like thinking has been given this element of superiority over feeling, which is considered a weakness. And I know culturally feelings hold something different as well. And being based in the Middle East, there is such a diversity culturally, and it's really interesting engaging with different cultures and how they perceive feelings. And there are many, many differences. From what I've learned is if there is that disconnect, it's a downward slope, very, very slippery slope. towards ill health and not being successful generally in life. But the stronger you are able to hone in that ability to think and feel and see that as an integrated ability and capacity. And like you mentioned with athletes, being able to really hone in that skill, the better you are at that, the healthier and more successful you're going to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's why I talk about authenticity a lot in leadership. There is no one single definitive leadership style. And I think those who attempt to restrain their true authentic self by adopting a certain style are the ones who struggle the most. And I think you should lean into your authenticity. And the only way you can do that, I think, is by tuning into those signals. What feels right as a leader? You know, I think that is where your real power is. But again, I think it requires you exploring and experimenting, as well as looking after your well-being, to be in a position to truly understand your authentic self. I want to talk a bit about the creator economy, because I think, you know, there's a public perception about influencers and creators more generally that I feel is grossly inaccurate. Many of these individuals are entrepreneurs. They're incredibly hardworking. They're very disciplined. However, it's a high stress environment. They're frequently isolated. There's a frequent quest or dependency on external validation, which can play havoc. What are the practical insights and techniques we can share with those creators who are isolated, but will enable them to live better and create better?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of experiences actually with this, with individuals who are creators who come into clinic and again end up having inflammatory based disorders, but predominantly that is not the core issue. The core issue is some of the challenges that they're having within their occupation. And it goes back to our earlier conversation about attaching your identity to your occupation. And I think a lot of creators spend such a heavy amount of time on social media. And we already know how well social media does prime our brain in terms of targeting specifically our reward system. So, you know, the number of likes and follows create a dopamine jump, surge, so to speak, and you almost get a little bit addicted to that. That combined with the isolation that often people experience socially from being in a creative role and the natural peaks and troughs that come with being in a very independent entrepreneurial role all take its toll. So it's, again, going back to basics. It's about making sure, because essentially humans are social beings. We thrive on enriching deep layered social relationships. So if you don't have those, it's about creating those. And if you do have them, maintaining them as much as possible, making sure you're moving on a regular basis. I mean, so many creators will tell you they'll spend 10, 12, 14 hours without moving.
Yeah.
And again, that's not how we are designed as humans. We are designed to move. So making sure you do that, eating well, sleeping well. And I think all of these elements sort of come in and will collide, and you'll be very much challenged, whether it's in a creator role or in a boardroom, but the same elements apply. And I think it's about going back to that foundation level of understanding of how we operate best as humans and making sure that we embed those within our daily working routines.
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly agree with you. And I would add self-compassion to that. I think when I look at creators beyond that singular dimension as they show up on social, I think you're talking about individuals who are hardworking, who are creative, but are frequently too hard on themselves, not showing sufficient self-compassion. So I think that's a really critical element. And I think, again, it's part of it is that exploration, that journey to understand that actually your value is not determined by how many followers you have. It's certainly not determined by the type of trolls that sadly show up on social media. So to your point, 100% agree, getting the fundamentals right, but also on an emotional level, understanding that your persona on social media is not the whole you.
Yeah. And what I find with creators is I find it takes a much higher level of toll on emotional, mental health, because for all the reasons you just mentioned. But again, going back to my sort of role in healthcare, what I see so often is how much the emotional, mental health challenges has on one's physical health.
Yeah.
So again, tying everything in quite nicely about how the body keeps a score. When you get physical symptoms, there isn't necessarily a physical issue, like a structural issue with your muscles or your joints or your tendons. Often it's the body's way of telling you you are neglecting yourself or you are not taking good care of yourself. So a physical symptom can guide you towards an unmet need within your emotional mental health. So it's really important to really listen to your body, and going back to your methodology of maintaining that path to your North Star. Everything is integrated, and learning to read those signs and signals will only help you to get to your goal faster.
Absolutely. So before I moved back to London, 17 years in region, you've been here now for
15 years.
15. And look, we both agree it's a special place and a very exciting, dynamic environment. But that, of course, comes with its own set of challenges when it comes to the pace of change, that sense you need to be always on. And I know you've seen this firsthand in your clinical work.
Definitely. I think on so many different planes, there are a high level of challenges. I think there is a high level of expectation to be the best in your field. There is a higher expectation to receive a much higher level of service. And the game that people play over here is just a much higher level. And with that, naturally, will then enhance those pressures which have to be managed.
Yeah, I think if you look at places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi and Riyadh at the moment, you can make a strong case for saying they're the most exciting work environments in the world right now in terms of the level of dynamic change. And so I think as a leader, tremendously exciting, but also incredibly pressurized and extremely stressful. I'm now in London after 17 years living here. You're on the ground here. You've been here for 15 years.
Yeah.
What's your take on the pace of change and what that means for the demands of leadership?
I definitely think now that the population has increased quite significantly, I think throughout the Middle East, there's been a much higher level of expectation and demand, both within service provision, but also to be more successful. So I feel that much more now. But I actually think it might be better for you to answer that question because you've dipped in and out now. So it'd be lovely to know from your perspective what changes, what differences you find.
Yeah, I'll be slightly provocative. The region and certainly cities I've mentioned are on the cutting edge of what's happening in the 21st century. You see these amazing investments in AI from Abu Dhabi, for example. Riyadh is a city transformed, and Dubai just goes from strength to strength and increasingly is a global hub rather than just a regional hub. When it comes to leadership development, I'm not seeing it keep pace with that change. And that's a genuinely held belief. And so I think there's still a very siloed approach. I think there's still an approach based on outdated methods. And I think there's in some certain areas, an unwillingness to embrace what science tells us is fact. So I do think there's a duty of care piece missing in terms of ensuring that these leaders who are carrying immense pressure on their shoulders should be supported more in role, quite frankly. Not only because it's the right thing to do for them ethically, but also given their influence, what price do you put on then showing up better in role and performing better? The impact on a company's bottom line is very clear in that regard. But also, as you know very well, there's the network effect. If you're in a leadership role, because of the power dynamics, you have a huge influence on everyone around you. You know, it's quite literally that network effect. So if that leader is showing up better in role, the benefits are felt across the entire organization. What are you seeing while respecting confidentiality at a clinical level in that regard?
I think perhaps because of the element of my work, I do see the extreme end of that. So I see individuals when they are completely at burnout or even far beyond that and have got themselves into such a state. And often, again, even within my role, they'll often go to see other therapists before they come to see me because I'm a chronic pain management specialist. So I'm the last person that they come to see. And that's when things have gotten really bad. And what I tend to see is a strong disconnect between physical and mind, and a complete lack of understanding of how your health can impact on your work. I see individuals who are in a lot of pain and have a lot of inflammation and have completely lost their North Star and are so confused that they don't actually know what they need to do to get back on track. And that's really my main motivating role for being involved, I think, with this initiative, is to try and get to individuals within the corporate sector at an earlier level so that we can create an element of prevention, so that we can reduce the number of people that get to that point where it's so bad and they are feeling so incredibly distressed that they feel at a loss.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about that. I think at the moment there's a toxic cycle that's similar to gladiators in the arena. So leaders are in there fighting hard, working every hour until they're reaching burnout. And then this idea that, okay, pull them out of the arena, fix them up through a wellbeing program, and then throw them back in. And I think that's a toxic cycle that has to change. It's better for everybody involved to have a program that delivers sustainable transformation, prehab rather than rehab.
Yeah. And I think in addition to that, an added layer is often people choose to do that themselves because they are the seniors in that level, at that level where they don't have to necessarily make that choice, but they make that choice because they want to avoid having to make difficult decisions. But then what they actually end up doing is forcing themselves into a corner where they have to make a decision that they really have been trying to avoid all along. But if they're actually more confrontational and able to, again, address that discomfort and look at their life from an angle where, okay, this is uncomfortable, I do have to make some decisions that perhaps I don't want to, but they'd actually have a whole suite of, potential solutions that they could come up with. But if they avoid that process entirely, they are inevitably going to then corner those where they will only have one decision. And that's really what we want to try and prevent.